You see all these like Lego memes and these propaganda films that are put out by Iran. Some of them are so poignant and so funny and so obviously geared very cleverly for Western audiences. They go viral on social media. How did they come up with this?
I can't speak specifically to the memes and the videos that are being produced, but I can tell you it's a very, very developed, sophisticated and organized apparatus.
This is Borzou Daragahi of the Badlands podcast. Please subscribe to my newsletter, borzou.substack.com. That's BORZOU.substack.com. I'm here today with Kevin Schwartz. He is a scholar, a Persian speaker, and an Arabic speaker who specializes in Iran and the Middle East. He has been basically writing and researching about Iran, including its cultural and political institutions, for decades. He was just passing through Istanbul, and we sat down for a chat about Iran, the war, and the story of how we got here. Do they have like an Institute for Meme Studies or something like that comes up with this stuff?
I'll just reference the major entity in this regard is Ouj Media, which is a outfit of the IRGC. They have an in-house design firm called Khat Media that does a lot of the posters and promotional materials that promote regime ideology that appear on Telegram channels, that appear in real life, whether it's Vali Asr or otherwise. But in addition to that, you have other state-adjacent entities like Studio 34 that's heavily involved in producing different types of visual iconography and materials meant to circulate in real life and online. And the one thing I would just say, and I've written about this with my co-author and in a couple different outlets, an article in the British Journal of Middle Eastern Studies as well as one for visual studies, is that this is a very, very sophisticated enterprise. I think when people look at regime propaganda, they think about the Statue of Liberty with a skull face. They think about the picture of the American flag that says "Down with the USA" and has the bombs.
From the 80s.
It's from the 80s. Some of it has been repainted. You have the pictures of typically a hijab-wearing Iranian woman walking in front of the old U.S. embassy walls.
So outdated.
It's so outdated, but still there. But so people tend to think of that, and you know, we borrow a term from an academic who's looking at the Chinese context and talk about that as hard propaganda. That's really not trying to convince people of the regime's ideology. What it's meant to do is just surround and overpower. You put that on your walls, you continue to update them, repaint them, so people know that you're still there and you're still control. But the stuff you're referring to, and we see it all the time in Vali Asr, Revolution Square, we see it online, and probably in these viral videos as well, you see a softer propaganda, which is meant to change hearts and minds, which is meant to make you think a bit, which is meant, let's say, to tap into Iranian nationalist sentiment rather than just sentiment that's supportive of the Islamic Republic, or is meant to tap into anti-imperialist or leftist rhetoric. So it's very, very sophisticated. There are different modes of producing propaganda, and while we focus on the hard propaganda type, there's a whole world out there that's been developing for quite a long time. And I would say a lot of this is both appearing online and in real life, and it gets participation from people in and outside of Iran on social media or otherwise. And when people start engaging with it, when people start participating in circulating this propaganda, whether they want to critique it or not, I mean, what it's doing is it's elevating it and making it part of the discussion. And right now we can see that Iran's viral videos and its sophisticated propaganda apparatus is clearly part of the discussion and gaining more and more eyeballs, which is probably going to be to their benefit.
You wrote a really interesting piece about how the roots of this conflict really began in 2002, 2003, that this became sort of an inevitable kind of war with the whole axis of evil thing and the September 11th and the U.S. response to September 11th. That's really interesting because most people, they go back until like June of 2025 when Israel struck the Iranian nuclear sites and city of Tehran and so on, and they trace it back there. Why would you say that this traces way back to 2002?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, first I'll just note that I'm surprised how few people are interested in thinking about how we got here. Obviously, there's a current impulse to figure out where we're going next, what's going to happen between the U.S., Israel, and Iran, what's going to happen for the future of the Gulf. But I think it's important to have a brief conversation about what happened previously. And as I noted in the piece you referred to, I think there were two kind of major structural forces that laid the groundwork. I don't want to say causes because that's always difficult, but laid the groundwork for this to happen. And the first, I think, as you noted, really took shape after 2003, after the invasion of Iraq. And that was the development of, let's call it an Iran policy industry in Washington that saw Iran as the root cause of all evil and destabilization in the region. Whether this was couched in terms of creating a land bridge to Israel or a Shia crescent, it was understood that everything goes back to Iran. And when you have a simple diagnosis like this, the prognosis is going to be a simple solution, which would be cut off the head of the snake, as various Arab leaders have tried to articulate over the years. And I think, for the most part, in Washington, excepting a few voices, there was a belief in this attitude that you could solve the problems of the region if you could solve the Iran problem. And I think this particularly becomes a main narrative after 2003, and you see the U.S. get bogged down in Iraq, to say nothing of Afghanistan, and their incapability of spreading democracy throughout the region as they once hoped. So that's kind of one structural force. And people have written about this as well, that there's really a small bandwidth in which, or spectrum, I should say, in which people are willing to engage with Iran creatively, take into account their security situation, and think about how there could be an alternative policy that could reach an alternative future. The nuclear deal was an aberration, but it was also a victim to this type of entrenched thinking, that it was cast aside, believing that it wasn't strong enough, wasn't good enough, and the best thing to do would be to, eventually, like I said, cut off the head of the snake. The other structural force that was in place has been Israel, and particularly Netanyahu's laser focus on Iran's nuclear program. Already in his 2002 testimony, after he was voted out of office for the short period of being prime minister, in front of the U.S. Congress about weapons of mass destruction, in Iraq, he was laying the groundwork and referencing Iran's nuclear program as the next presumed target. Of course, his infatuation and fascination with Iran's nuclear program goes back even earlier. But for the next almost 2 decades, you hear him beating this war drum of Iran being, 2 weeks away, a month away from pursuing or actually gaining a nuclear weapon. And this gains a greater audience in places like U.S. Congress or the United Nations, which tends to create this kind of feedback loop that we need to, cut off the head of the snake and address Iran's destabilization activities.
I hear that a lot now, this kind of revisionism about Iraq, for example, that the reason why the U.S. lost Iraq was because of Iran. And I'm sitting there, having been in Iraq for all those years as a correspondent, and saying, no, actually, Iraq was an open door for the Iranians. It was the U.S. in Fallujah and Anbar that alienated the Sunnis, began the cycle of violence, and then against the Shia militias formed, and only then did Iran come into the play. So I see what you're saying there. And do you think that there is this kind of revisionism going on in Washington right now, where all of the failures of the U.S. are being attributed to Iran in the Middle East?
It kind of sounds like that, and also plays into this idea of Iran being this masterful puppeteer that's controlling Hezbollah, the Houthis, the PMF in Iraq, and other groups, other Shia militias throughout the world. And there's no doubt that they have connections with these groups. They arm them, they provide them with technology and information and intelligence. But again, there's a major spectrum of engagement. I mean, on one end you have Hezbollah, which I think is the most kind of hierarchically embedded in the Iranian system. Then on the other hand, you have the Houthis that are demonstrating.
They do what they want.
They do what they want, and they have kind of independence, and everyone's kind of looking right now. Why haven't they done anything? Well, maybe they decided it's not in their best interest to do anything. And so I think you're right in that people look at Iraq and they say, okay, Iran was involved either directly or indirectly, and if we just got rid of Iran, for example, the Shia PMF wouldn't have an axe to grind. And this is what really bothers me. It's as if, the Houthis or Hezbollah or the PMF or even Hamas don't have their own agency. Like as if you suddenly cut off the head of the snake, these people wouldn't have some kind of problem with U.S. security-led architecture where they've been kind of left aside or marginalized either internationally or domestically. And ultimately, I think all people, whether they're Hezbollah, Houthis, or otherwise, just want to live with dignity. I don't think they're necessarily interested in ruining other people's lives, and certainly not doing so at the behest of Iran.
So, Kevin, you talked about history a little bit and going back to 2002. Why do you think that, and this is a very general question, but a lot of people have this question. In the 1980s, Israel, Iran, the U.S., they were kind of dealing with each other, and they had a kind of understanding, U.S. was on the side of Iraq, but they also sold weapons indirectly to Iran. There was no crisis in the Middle East. What happened, do you think, I guess, after the Iran-Iraq war, after the first Gulf War, that created this uptick in tensions between Iran and the U.S.?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, obviously, politics and war make strange bedfellows, and as you noted, there was an arms triangle between Israel and the U.S. and Iran at that time. I mean, I think it probably goes back to the fact that you had the Osirak nuclear reactor being struck in 1981 by Israel, the fact that you had the first Gulf War, sanctions, no-fly zones in place, and there'd always been an idea in the U.S. government, and I think with the GCC, of dual containment, that you have to contain Iraq and Iran. And so as Iraq becomes less and less of a threat, it becomes more isolated, it becomes more kind of inward-looking, it becomes more contained. Naturally, I think the next target would turn to Iran. And as I noted, it's part of this kind of long arc of disarmament that I think both Israel and the U.S. desired, that no one in the region can be allowed to have nuclear weapons. There cannot be nuclear parity between Israel and another country. So you have, Iraq's reactor in 1981. You have the little-remembered episode in 2007 when Israel struck a reactor in Syria because they said it was built by North Korea, being used possibly to develop nuclear weapons. 2003, and after you have Libya decides to voluntarily disarm. I mean, that only leaves Iran left. And so I think it was only natural that eventually they would seek some kind of disarmament, either through a nuclear deal or through some kind of military confrontation.
Iran was a devastated country in 1988 and after the Iran-Iraq war. And yet somehow now and there has been this assumption that it was a kind of paper tiger full of bluster. Wow, it surprised many people, including myself, in terms of its capabilities, in terms of its military creativity. In retrospect, when do you think it seems obviously it's been prepared for this war way more than the U.S. and Israel even. When do you hypothesize this preparation began, and what were the principles, if I may ask you to kind of tax a little bit your expertise outside of your own political science area into like military strategy and so on. When do you think and how do you think they started preparing for this conflict?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure I know the answer. I think it's important to remember, and you alluded to the fact that the main event for the Islamic Republic in terms of its genesis narrative is not necessarily the revolution, but it's the Iran-Iraq war. When the whole world, except for a couple countries, was against them, they were left alone, and they faced, a very bitter rival and had a really destructive experience that touched just about everyone in society and continues to touch everyone in society. And so I think that allowed the regime to kind of cohere internally. When you talk about the development of the IRGC, people always think about the IRGC as the Quds Force and what it's doing outside of Iran's borders, but that allowed it to kind of develop and build internally as a real behemoth, whether it's in terms of operating elements of the government, being involved in construction and home loans. They really are the main force of power in that country. As far as when they started preparing for this confrontation, I'm not really sure. I think they probably always recognized that they would have to have some kind of standoff with Israel and the U.S. down the road, that they expect it would be a military confrontation. I don't know about that. But what I can say is that I think they've done, at least up to this point, a kind of smart thing in developing their strategy, which is they have been doing what they're able to do and what they know, which is building bridges to other kind of Shia groups in the region, whether it's Hezbollah or the PMF in Iraq or elsewhere, to kind of have a policy of what was called forward deterrence. So you could fight your adversaries outside of your borders rather than face them inside your borders. This is not a country that could build military bases across the Gulf. So I think they did a very good job, just out of kind of interest and necessity, of building bridges to different groups. They ended up being Shia groups, but I don't think that's necessarily what guided their political calculus. I think they figure they need to build some kind of deterrence network outside their borders. Why not go with Shia groups you have a kind of natural ideological allegiance with?
When do you think, or at what point did the idea in the Islamic Republic crystallize that the U.S. was going to become an existential threat? Was it 1979 or was it later?
Where the U.S. would become an existential threat for Iran?
A military threat, yeah.
I don't know. It might be much, much later. It might not be until we have the attack on Iran's nuclear sites in June 2025. I think that Iran had developed this idea of strategic patience. That is to signal that they don't want a war, but they're willing to kind of confront the U.S. when necessary. But it seems like those kind of strategies were clearly not taken in return. So after the June 2025 strike on Iran's nuclear reactor, I think you had the U.S., or rather Iran, strike a U.S. base in the Middle East. They tipped off the U.S. this was going to happen. They made sure there would be kind of no casualties there. But I think that was taken in the U.S., rather than being a policy of patience, one of weakness. And I should refer, that goes back to actually after Qasem Soleimani.
Right.
was killed. And I think a lot of people who are looking at the failure of the strategic patience, even forward deterrence, will go back to that point, and that the Iranians now recognize they probably should have responded a bit more forcefully to Qasem Soleimani's assassination when he was at the Baghdad airport. I think that was in 2020. So I think it was probably at that point when they started to recognize that if they weren't going to take a more confrontational approach to the United States, then their existence could be in jeopardy.
What do you think of the U.S. hubris? It seems like a little bit, and Israeli hubris. The idea, I don't know, they deny it now. U.S. officials and their defenders deny that they thought that this was going to be a quick war. But if you go back to their original commentary, they obviously, sought a Venezuela-style solution, take out the head capo, and then the lower people in the mafia gang would just glom onto anyone that we put up there. Why do you think that there was so much hubris in the camp of U.S. and Israel?
I mean, you're correct, of course. There's a ton of hubris to think that the Islamic Republic would just crumble after these decapitation strikes that included the assassination of the supreme leader. But I would also point that there's a kind of more general hubris that goes on with Israel and U.S. actions in the region, and that is their kind of callousness and carelessness toward human life, toward civilian life, which invariably will be impacted with any kind of attacks, whether it's in Yemen or Lebanon, Iraq or Iran. And it's as if the people in the region are somehow inured from this, they're insulated from this. We all have short memories that somehow after all this, we're going to say, okay, well, you took out this regime. You also killed a lot of people who were innocent, but that's water under the bridge. Let's just move on and let bygones be bygones. I think there's a real hubris there that they think they somehow are doing what's morally right for people and for the future of the region, when in fact they're in fact killing many civilians.
We spoke a little bit earlier about the protests in January, the heartbreaking response of the regime. I mean, I don't know. I never thought that those were completely fake protests, as the regime says. But it does seem like there was some Mossad involvement, genuine, not just psychological misinformation being presented. What do you think of those protests in retrospect? Whether there was whether there was 3,000 people killed, 7,000 people killed, 30,000 people killed. It's almost irrelevant, but just the fact that there was this sort of genuine protest and the regime cracked down on it. The regime has its narrative saying that, we were confronted with an external force. The international community is saying, like, look, you have to answer for these protests. What is your opinion about the impact of those?
Yeah, it's really impossible to know. I mean, there's a media blackout in Iran. I don't think we'll ever know how many people perished during those protests. To me, they were in fact genuine, and they did represent a desperation and a complete disapproval of the regime. I mean, if you go all the way back to the 2009 protests after the contested presidential election, the first slogan was "Where's my vote?" So people were trying to ascertain whether the regime legally would count their vote as they said they would. They appeared to have not done so. So that kind of legal avenue was shut off. Obviously, you had the Women Like Freedom protests. You had other economic protests as well. With the economic protests, people kind of protesting due to inflation, the decrease of gas subsidies, the price of eggs or milk, recognizing that there wouldn't be a quick fix in that regard. It now became clear their economic grievances would not be addressed. And then you have the June 2025 war, whereby the regime proved itself incapable of safeguarding the people from a security standpoint. So I think up to that point, you could have said, well, they're not going to address our legal rights. They're not going to address our economic grievances. At least, we're buying into this idea that they're supporting all these groups outside of our borders to keep us safe. But now they can no longer keep us safe. We don't even have our security. So I think everything kind of led to those protests at the end of 2025, early 2026, where people had just lost hope and all other doors, possible doors for grievances, were being closed, whether it be legal reform or economic reform.
I see people on social media and in the public, and they're rooting for Iran. People in the United States, they're rooting for Iran in this war, especially after the school bombing on the first day of the war, the targeting of civilian infrastructure, as you mentioned, the callousness towards civilian life, collateral damage. What do you say? Why does it seem like the Iranians are fighting the war kind of well on their own terms? At least they're not defending their territory very well because they can't, but they're pursuing the war well on the battlefield overall, but also just like winning the PR war globally.
Yeah, I think people are looking around and seeing what any normal person would see. Well, there were ongoing negotiations in June 2025. There were ongoing negotiations prior to this war. In fact, there was a nuclear agreement already in place, and it was a nuclear agreement that was disavowed by the U.S. It was the U.S. and Israel that decided to bomb Iran back to the negotiation table in June 2025, which many European countries were cheerleaders for. And the same thing happened again. I mean, what we know from the Omani government and their spokespeople is that some kind of deal was actually close, but in fact, the U.S. and Israel pursued this war of choice. So I think, again, it goes back to this kind of hubris argument that, U.S. and Israeli policymakers think we're going to look at the world through their eyes. And this doesn't mean one has to defend what the regime is doing, particularly inside their borders, because that is despicable and it's not something that most people want to live with. Though I will just say parenthetically, that's for the people inside those borders to decide. But in terms of how the U.S. and Israel is creating destruction throughout the region, choosing war instead of peace, choosing to kill or accept civilian casualties for their policy goals, I think most people see that as morally abhorrent. And so in many ways, Iran doesn't have to make a huge leap to win hearts and minds in this way.
There was this extraordinary video, and it starts off with the grave. It's like a grave. And then inside that grave, there's little animations of little girls and children playing, screaming, fun, having fun, dancing, jumping rope, talking, et cetera, et cetera. And then the camera pans out, and it's the scene of those 160 girls, the grave sites and people watching there. And it was just people were commenting on Twitter and X or whatever. They were saying that this is beyond propaganda. This is kind of powerful filmmaking. It's hard to describe something like that as propaganda. Where do you think what would you say about that? Is it propaganda? Is it a poignant commentary? Is it political commentary?
Yeah.
Is it political cartoon?
It's a little bit of both, and I think I've been pretty loose with my use of propaganda here. But as I was alluding to with the dichotomy between hard and soft propaganda, it's always not so clear cut. But I think we can all agree that the killing of whatever it was, 170 plus young girls due to American missile is heart-wrenching, and it's going to touch on emotions well beyond what the Islamic Republic wants to promote in terms of its ideology.
And finally, I guess, how long do you think this will go on? What do you think will happen with global markets? And everyone is worried about a recession. Some economists and energy experts that I talked to said that, the recession is going to happen no matter what. It's already too late. That supply chains globally are so tight that this disruption is going to create ripple effects that will outlast any war. Even if the war ends tomorrow, we won't get back to normal for 2 years. Some people are saying. What do you think is going to be the future of the conflict and how it will impact the world?
I can't presume to know. I think we're in a very, very unpredictable phase. I think one thing we can say right now is that the U.S. will not tolerate the status quo, that is the Strait of Hormuz not being open and not being operating to its full capacity, and that the status quo ante, which occurred prior to the war, ironically, when the strait was open, is not going to be a situation that Iran wishes to return to. So I think we're at a kind of crossroads here. Iran wants the status quo at least to remain for some time, to have greater control of the strait. The U.S. won't accept that. So I think we're going to have to wait and see to what extent either Trump will use military force to subdue Iran and to try to open up the strait again, or whether he's willing to cut a deal that would allow Americans some special treatment in gaining access to either Iran's oil markets or just the Strait of Hormuz. But I can't see the Iranians being willing to accept that. So I don't have a very good answer except to say that I don't know, and it seems rather unpredictable. But we're at a very very delicate pivot point here.
Kevin Schwartz, thank you so much for sitting down for this interview. I appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much, Borzu. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Kevin is Deputy Director of the Oriental Institute. That's part of the Czech Academy of Sciences based in Prague. He's also working on a book tentatively titled Visualizing the Islamic Republic. I'm Borzu Daragahi. This has been the Badlands Podcast. Please subscribe at borzu.substack.com. Thank you for listening.